This is Steve Hovington from B Movie. And you're listening to the New Wave Music Podcast.
Welcome back to the New Wave Music Podcast. As always, I'm Steve. I'm joined by T-Bone. I'm thrilled to say today we are joined by a new wave icon. He's behind such hits as Europa and the Pirate Twins. Hyperactive. And no doubt you'll recognize his mega hit, She Blinded Me with Science. That's right. Today we're joined by Thomas Dolby. Thomas, thank you so much for being with us today.
Hey, nice to be here.
Yeah, we're thrilled to have you with us. So let's go way, way back. You were born Thomas Morgan Robertson. How did you come about using the name Dolby?
Yeah, so when I was in school, I was the first kid to get a cassette player and a set of headphones. And in those days, for a cassette player to be worth its salt, it had to have a Dolby button. So that became my nickname. I was always wandering around school with this big, hefty Philips cassette player and these massive, bulky headphones. So they called me Dolby. I left school, and at the time, gigging in London, there was a guy called Tom Robinson of the Tom Robinson Band. And I went backstage to one of his gigs in Hammersmith, and I said, you know, we've got very similar names. Why don't we make a deal that whoever makes it first, the other one will change his name? And we shook on it, and about 3 months later, he had a hit in the charts with 2468 Motorway, and so I changed my name to Dolby.
Well, and as I understand it, Dolby Labs made it clear that they didn't want you to use the word Dolby outside of using it with Thomas. Is that the case?
Yeah, Dr. Ray Dolby, who invented the noise reduction system, no relevant relative of mine, obviously, had a son called Thomas, who I now know, and we're friendly, actually. He's quite a successful film producer and young adult fiction writer. But at the time, Dr. Ray was very upset with me for what he assumed was like sort of stealing his brand. And so we had a lengthy lawsuit at the end of which was a complete stalemate. And we sort of decided not to pursue it any further.
Oh, okay. Interesting. And how did you get introduced to synthesizers, keyboards, and electronics?
Well, I started teaching myself to play piano when I was, 11 or 12. And I mainly learned from friends. I never really learned to read music. And at the time, there were very interesting, this is the middle of the 70s, there were very interesting, what you would now call prog rock bands like Yes and Genesis and Steely Dan and Pink Floyd and so on, that were doing, you know, very cool music that included some elements of jazz and sort of, you know, mid 20th century songwriting, chord sequences and things like that, you know, as well as great playing. So half of my school would listen to that music and the other half would listen to, you know, Led Zepp and Black Sabbath and Deep Purple. And they were sort of the yob. So we were the thinkers. So on my side of that fence, I was very keen to emulate some of those bands until in fact punk rock came along. So I was sort of 16, 17 when that hit, and Sex Pistols and The Clash and stuff. And it was socially very exciting to go to clubs and spike up your hair and be rude to everybody and everything. But it wasn't musically very stimulating to me. Around about the same time, there was a sort of an alternative movement, which was really spearheaded by the arrival of the compilations between David Bowie and Brian Eno, when they went to Berlin and did the Low album, which was very much inspired by German, what we call krautrock bands that most people have never heard of, Tangerine Dream and Kraftwerk and so on. But Bowie, being the maven that he was, discovered these bands, went to Berlin, did those amazing albums. It was the first time there was pop music being made entirely with synthesizers. That was very inspiring to my generation, A, because we were already disciples of Bowie, but B, because it had this DIY ethic to it. The sense was that, okay, if you can do it with a bunch of machines, then anybody could go in their back room and make a record and become a pop star. And so that was really what was the springboard for a generation of musicians in the London underground at the time.
Yeah, I think that Berlin trilogy was a huge inspiration for a lot of artists at the time.
Yeah, and it was very anti-commercial. It didn't sound anything like punk rock, but it was punk in a way, because right at the height of what appeared to be the height of his commercial success, after Young Americans and Fame and things like that, Bowie turned his back on all of that and went and did this sort of rather obscure sounding electronic album with Eno. So that was very much a statement of rebellion as far as we were concerned. So it had a sort of a punk ethic to it, although obviously it didn't sound anything like the Sex Pistols.
So, Thomas, I heard a story or a rumor that you wrote She Blinded Me with Science over the course of a weekend as you pitched the video idea and you didn't have a song to go with it. Is that true?
Well, not really a rumor, Steve, because I've only talked about it about 100 times in interviews. So MTV was taking off. So my first album came out, The Golden Age of Wireless, came out in the USA. Got great reviews, won a few awards, and sold about 3 copies. And so that commercially, obviously, was not going to be my ticket to fame. But at the same time, MTV was starting to take off. It had just reached major cities. It was very inspiring to me that you could represent your music now in a different kind of way. You could use the platform of an MTV video as a way to tell your story. Now, I'd always been, a sort of amateur filmmaker wannabe, big fan of early silent movies. And in silent movies, you had underdog heroes like Chaplin and Keaton and Harold Lloyd and so on, who, despite the worst intentions of the big bully, would sort of end up getting the girl. And that was really the way that I sort of cast myself as a personality. So, I wanted to do an MTV video that would be like an extension of my song. But I wrote the storyboard. I drew the storyboard for the video before I had a song. And I took it into my record company, EMI, and persuaded them to give me a few grand to make the video. And they said, well, but when do we hear the song? And I said, I'll have it for you on Monday morning. And then I went home and wrote the song pretty much as the soundtrack to the video.
So were you surprised that She Blinded Me with Science became such a huge worldwide hit?
No, I think it should have been a bigger hit. I still think that. Well, I mean, I'm glad that it's still being played because, there are other higher charting records at the time that are long forgotten. I wasn't particularly surprised. I just, as soon as the hook popped into my head and the beat, I was fairly convinced. And then I think the crowning glory really was managing to grab Dr. Magnus Pike for the recording and the video.
Now, change of subject just a little bit. I felt that 1988's Aliens Ate My Buick was highly underrated, and with great songs like Airhead. She's an airhead, stung on a mice, come and get plates, stay lost in space. And she's an airhead, thousands in trust, cost Aquarius, get serious. The key to her Ferrari. I'm gonna rub it, shine it, rev it, scoot it, skid it, jam it, rib it, skim it, run it. I'm done what I want, don't want your love, don't want your money, girl. Said all I want is the key of my rain. Oh! And the outstanding track, The Ability to Swing. The ability to swing, the ability to swing. Dreams, take them away and go it alone. Honey Road wasn't built in a day, but now it's a ruin. The joker's worn thin, and it isn't cool to abuse the ability to swing. The album has a very different sound from your previous work. How important it is for you to expand your sound?
It's vitally important, really. I don't know why, but I have this sort of relentless pursuit of the new thing. And I hate the idea of covering ground that I've already covered or that other people have explored. I'm at my most excitable when I'm sort of out in new territory, investigating things and trying out new tools and having ideas that I feel are really fresh. So yeah, I moved to the USA. I moved to Los Angeles to make that album, and I was kind of shocked really by Californian culture, and I had that sort of backlash reaction that a lot of expatriate Brits come, I think, get when they go when they first come to the USA. Everything seemed to be very garish, very much a car culture, very much a culture. And the way that TV and commercialism sort of seem to rule everything, but built into that a certain paranoia, about the infiltration of aliens or communists or whatever it might be, people with different styles of hair from you. He doesn't smoke the same cigarettes as me, so that there was a lot of that sort of backlash. But I was having a great time, and so when I made Aliens at My Buick, it was kind of like a postcard home, look at me, mum, I'm having a great time. And, the whole album, I think, reflects that with a lot of energy. And until you get to the final song, Budapest by Blimp, which is a very sort of sad, grieving look back at the old world of Europe.
Turn into mist on evening dew. And a photograph just aren't the same. There is a train that's leaving soon.
Quite possibly my favorite song of yours is I Live in a Suitcase.
I came here the hard way, and now I'm living in a suitcase. And I came here the hard way. I'm living in a suitcase, in a suitcase. I live in a suitcase.
From 1992's Astronauts and Heretics. The song always makes me think of you being out on the road for long periods of time, but I figured I'd ask you what that song means.
That's kind of a lonely song, written sitting up at Griffith Park one night. I was looking out over the city, and there was a power outage, like a sort of brownout, and about half of Los Angeles went dark. Although obviously you could see the lights on the freeways, almost like you were seeing through to the sort of the veins underneath of the city. And I just had this flash at that point of perspective about the whole thing, and suddenly I could see the sky, and it just seemed to be this sort of dome over us, and it really seemed like a theater, the entertainment that's created there, and so I sort of came up with this idea, it's theater in the round with stars instead of a crowd, and it turned into I Live in a Suitcase, bemoaning the fact that I didn't really feel at home there. I felt like a visitor, a sort of infiltrator. I didn't think that was where I was going to end up. So I Live in a Suitcase sort of reflected the fact that this is a transitory period for me.
Yeah, gorgeous song.
I'd also just met Kathleen in that period. She was the best thing to come out of LA for me. And so it's also in a way a love song, because I'm sort of saying, but you, little ingenue, I made a home here inside of you. And so who needs a home to go to? I can live out of a suitcase so long as I have you.
So you've collaborated with a variety of artists throughout your career. One artist that you collaborated with, our listeners may not know, is that you played synths on the Thompson Twins' In the Name of Love. Are there any collaborations that stood out to you, particularly either memorable or meaningful?
I think the most meaningful was with a band called Prefab Sprout. Not a lot of people know about in the USA, which is sad because they're an amazing band. They were often called in the UK sort of our answer to Steely Dan. They have very literate songs that tell stories. They have very intricate chord sequences, a very unusual vocal sound. Paddy McAloon, who's the singer and songwriter of the band, has a very personal, very intimate voice. Wendy Smith, who sings the harmonies, has a sort of pristine, very pure voice that is almost like a foil, that's sort of like a frame for Paddy's, the personality in Paddy's voice. I met them when they were fairly new to the music industry, and I was like a little bit more sort of advanced and, in my career than they were, and I had more experience in the studio. So I became their producer for 2.5 albums. And I mean, commercially in the UK and many territories around the world, they were more successful than I was. The exception being the USA, where they never really took off. And part of that was because they didn't tour very much, and they couldn't come over here and tour to back it up. But yeah, and I mean, they made some amazing records that still show up in top 100 albums of all time lists in places like NME and those sort of British music intelligentsia.
Yeah, you must have been reading my mind, because that was going to be my next question is not only the collaborations that you've had with other artists like, Howard Jones, Stevie Wonder, George Clinton, but I was going to ask how you got involved with Prefab Sprout. And Steve McQueen in particular is just an absolutely brilliant album.
Yeah, well, thanks. Yeah, it's very special to me. I mean, their albums paralleled mine in some ways. We both had a sort of brilliant but flawed debut, followed by an album that is still played today and regarded as a classic, Flat Earth for me, Steve McQueen for them, followed by the more garish sort of outgoing, tongue-in-cheek album, Aliens Ate My Buick for me, and From Langley Park to Memphis for them, followed by the sort of literary masterwork, which was which was Astronauts and Heretics for me, and Jordan, the Comeback for Prefab Sprout. So we had those 4 albums, were very parallel in many ways.
Oh, you're bringing back memories. Those are all great albums. Absolutely. You started scoring movies in the late 80s, including Gothic and Howard the Duck. Were you looking for a new challenge, or was there just any different reason for trying out that field?
I always loved the idea that, you sit there in your seat with your bucket of popcorn and the lights go down and we've got your full attention. It's like you're sat between good speakers, you're in a darkened room, and it's other than a concert setting, it's the most attentive you'll ever be to whatever I'm going to hit you with musically or sonically. I like that idea, and I like the idea of music as a sort of a secondary medium, secondary to a picture, story, acting, dialogue, etc. And I like the idea of taking a back seat like that. I wish I'd done more of it, really, because I spent the last 10 years teaching it at university level, and I feel a bit of a fraud, really, having only done a few things. I was involved with a lot of movies. Howard the Duck I didn't score. I wrote the songs for it.
Oh, gotcha.
John Barry did the score. I did Gothic with Ken Russell, and before that, a film called Fever Pitch. Contributed to a lot of different films during my time in California. And it's something that I may get back to, I think, in my advancing years. There's so much good stuff coming out now between all of the indie films and prestige TV, combined with the fact that now, in the box, as we say, on your computer, you can have like a fabulous orchestral sample library or whatever, and you can make really magnificent sounding scores, without needing to spend hundreds of dollars an hour.
Now, your last album, Map of the Floating City, was released in 2011. Many of the bands we cover on this podcast have continued releasing albums, sometimes literally, 40 years after their last. And I was wondering if we might see a new one from you soon.
I don't have any particular plans at the moment. Album is sort of an antiquated concept, rather quaint at this point. All of mine in their way were sort of concept albums, so it's hard to imagine pulling them apart and having the songs come out independently. I could see myself doing a single or an EP or something like that. As far as making an album, to be perfectly honest, the music industry is so different now. So much of it is really about how you sort of game the algorithm and get in people's feeds. And on a certain level, I enjoy learning a new skill, but it's not one that particularly appeals to me. And I can't imagine a Sony or a Warner's or somebody is going to is going to sign me up and decide that, they want to make me a big star at this point in my life. So I think it would involve a lot of self-promotion, and I get tired of sort of blowing my own trumpet, really.
Yeah. One thing that some artists have done that I think overall it's been fairly successful them is to create their own music and then put it on something like Bandcamp, where they don't need a label or anything like that to promote the music, and they can actually make more of the money straight from Bandcamp than they might from having a label.
Yeah, I mean, when I did a map of the floating city, it was, I think, the beginning of the era where that was truly becoming possible. You could make music in your back room, or in my case, in my back garden, in a converted lifeboat, powered by the wind and the sun. And then you could distribute it, via Bandcamp or CD Baby or whatever it was back then. But I mean, I think in aggregate, I sort of feel like A Map of the Floating City was an album that I'm extremely proud of. I put a lot of love into it. I think it's some of my best work ever, certainly the most mature and introspective. And on a certain level, I think it sort of, it got lost a little bit in the tens of thousands of records that come out every week at this point. I welcome and embrace the fact that it's much more of a level playing field now. I think, back when I started, you were very, very lucky to get a record deal. You became part of the elite that were sort of put in front of the public. But outside of the signed bands, there was no way to get heard by the public. So I consider myself very lucky to be in that elite. But I think that these days, you're competing with 10,000 other guys that put out an album that week. And yeah. I think from a democratic standpoint, that's really good news and really encouraging to young artists starting out, like my students, that they have a level playing field. It's discouraging to more of what we'll call a legacy artist. And you probably hear this from a lot of the people that you interview. The idea of suddenly, becoming part of the swamp is not all that appealing.
So, Thomas, looking back on your career, what would you say are some of the highlights or your proudest moments?
It's hard. If an album takes 7 months to record, it's hard to describe it as a proudest moment. So I tend to focus on sort of gigs and events. I mean, those would be playing Live Aid with David Bowie in 1985, playing The Wall in Berlin with Roger Waters in 1990. Playing the Rose Bowl, I think the same year or the year after, with Depeche Mode in LA. So those moments, absolutely, are big, big moments for me. So I tend to sort of, I look back with rose-colored spectacles and I think about those moments. But in reality, the longer-term projects that did take months of planning and execution, I consider sort of bigger achievements than like a one-off live event.
So we know that you wrote the memoir, The Speed of Sound. However, I recently just discovered you wrote a novel called Prevailing Wind, and that's about to release. What can you tell us about this book?
So this is a historical fiction novel. It's set in 1913, and the background for it is the America's Cup yacht racing series and the New York Yacht Club, which was populated by the billionaires of the day, robber barons and railroad owners, factory owners, and so on. And they had these enormous yachts, the biggest sailing yachts ever built, that they would race against each other and against the Brits in the America's Cup. But to crew these things, you needed a crew of 35 or 40 men. And they would get these men from Maine lobster towns because they were very hardy, they were great sailors, and because they were religious. So at night, they would lie in their hammocks reading their Bibles instead of going out drinking. And they would cheap, especially when when the fishing was bad. So these really ideal crew for these billionaires. So I've always been a huge fan of classic sailing yachts. And I decided to write this story from the point of view of two Deer Isle, Maine sailors who get the chance to try out for the crew of an America's Cup yacht and get sucked into the world of the New York Yacht Club, the progressive age, and all of the tension at the time between the unions and the suffragettes and the Triangle Shirt Factory fire and things like that. The Ludlow massacre. There was just weird stuff going on right before World War I at the time, and it hasn't been written about much in historical fiction.
So what inspired you to become a fiction author? Was it just another task or another accomplishment you wanted to do, or another challenge?
Another challenge for sure. I mean, I like writing. I don't think it's as natural a medium to me as as music is, but that's exactly what draws me to it, is an opportunity to get better at something and to really try and master something. And I might do more of it in the future. So, I don't think you ever become a master really, but it's been a fascinating journey, and doing the research for it was amazing. It took me to Deer Isle, Maine. It took me to the New York Yacht Club, into their archives, into their libraries. Took me to St. George's, Bermuda, where one of my scenes takes place. Researching it has been just an amazing experience for me.
That is fascinating. Now, you kind of alluded to this a little bit, but you've also done a fair amount of academic work, including with Johns Hopkins University. You mentioned your students. Can you tell us what you're doing with that, and have you've continued that work?
Yeah, so I've been at Johns Hopkins for the last 10 years at the Peabody Institute, which is their music conservatory in Baltimore, Maryland. And I founded a program there called Music for New Media. And this is for composers that want to write for picture, be it film, TV, video games, virtual reality, installations, applications, some medical uses and things like that. And this has been going quite successfully now for the last 6 or 7 years. We have about 40 students in the program. And at Peabody, they do conventional music studies, theory, sight reading, humanities, and things like that. But they also work with me to score and do sound design for films and video games.
A little change of subject. Thomas, can you share any memorable stories or anecdotes from your time touring?
Yeah, I mean, I was never like a crazy rock and roller, really. I would sort of go against the grain. And at the beginning of a tour, I'd get out a map and say, look, there are 3 national parks we can visit. We can go on a nice hike. There's a couple of museums I would like to visit, some interesting lectures we can synchronize with. And everybody would go knowingly, oh, yeah, it'd be great to have a tour like that. And about 2 days into the tour, that's all out the window. And people are at the hotel bar at 3 o'clock in the morning. And, the tour manager is trying to get them out of bed in time for checkout so you can catch taxis to the airport. So it tends to revert to kind, a lot of touring. I really enjoy it. I mean, I think that it's gotten much slicker and more professional over the years. COVID was a huge blow really to the industry. And,
Yes.
Way before COVID, I would see these sort of, 62-year-old roadies humping flight cases. And sometimes I sort of say, do you have a plan B? Do you have any medical insurance or retirement plan? Nah, mate, I'll just keep doing this till I drop. And then COVID hit and they couldn't keep doing it. So people forget, you talk about entertainers not being able to keep touring during COVID, but you forget about all of the support staff, the sound and lights people and the venue staff and so on that, lost their livelihoods during that time. And many of them did not have a plan B. So, yeah, I mean, I'm hoping that this tour I do later this year is going to, I haven't really been out since COVID. And so it's going to be interesting to see whether the industry is really back on its feet again.
Well, speaking of touring, you mentioned it this summer, you're headlining a pretty big 80s tour throughout the U.S. How did you become involved with the Totally Tubular Festival?
When they first approached me, a guy called John Pleater, who is an agent promoter, approached me with this idea. And at the time, I think the Human League were going to headline it, and they asked me if I would go on the bill. And the Human League then dropped out for their own reasons. And John sort of said, "Hey, we like the idea of you closing the show." And I sort of said, "Well, that's very flattering, but I've actually, compared to some of the other acts on the bill, like Thompson Twins, Tom Bailey or whatever, I actually had fewer hits than he did." And they sort of said, "Yeah, but the difference between the way you're perceived and a lot of other 80s, so-called 80s acts is that a lot of them have 1 or 2 original members and members have been replaced. They broke up and reformed. You never broke up, and you are the original lineup. And you don't tour year in, year out. You've hardly played for the last 10 or 20 years. So I can present this as, you are the crown jewel of this lineup. This is something really authentic, a rare chance to see Professor Dolby in concert. And so I thought, well, okay, twist my arm. That's too good to be true, really.
So what can audiences expect to see during your set during the festival?
We all play short sets, playing about 35 minutes. It's going to be the songs you're most likely to know, to be perfectly honest. I don't, in 35 minutes, I don't have time to go into the deep cuts. There's a couple of shows along the road that are just me and Tom Bailey, where I'll have a little bit more time to do extra songs. But yeah, the festival set, if you listed my top 7 or 8, best known songs, it would be those.
Oh, nice. Looks like you're going to have a busy summer after the Totally Tubular Festival. You're heading to the UK for a tour with Martin McAloon from Prefab Sprout. Anything you can tease our UK audiences about those shows?
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be a more expanded show. I'll have a little bit more time. Martin in support to me on the bill. So Martin, whose brother Paddy McAloon was the singer-songwriter in Prefab Sprout. I haven't seen him play live, but by his own account, he goes out there on his own with an acoustic and he says, look, I can't really sing and I can't really play, but you guys can sing. So they just sing the songs and he strums them on guitar, is what I've heard, but he's got a great sense of humor, Mark. So it should be really interesting. So yeah, we're not playing together. He's supporting me, and then I'm going to do a set of my own, which will be, same songs from the Totally Tubular tour, plus probably the same number again of sort of my favorite, deep cuts from the albums.
So Thomas, what's the best way for our listeners to stay up to date with all things Thomas Dolby, whether it be your tour, you releasing new music, or even how to order the brand new book?
You should go to thomasdolby.com and everything's listed there. If you're on, Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or whatever, I'm pretty easy to find. It's either Thomas Dolby or like official Thomas Dolby or Thomas Dolby official, whatever. YouTube, I've got a lot of stuff, and I sort of use YouTube as a kind of a vlog, with things that I update people about. So any of those would be a good place to go. So yeah, check it out and come down to the tour. And please buy my book. It's just gone live on Amazon in pre-order, so it'll be out in June. Prevailing Wind in the historical fiction section.
I think that's fantastic.
I do have to say, I did check out some of your YouTube videos on there, your vlogs. I really enjoyed the last one you released about how you got your hair back.
Thank you. Yeah, people were asking. I just fancied a change of point of view. After 30 or 40 years with a shaved head, you run out of sort of options or ways to express yourself. So, but a lot of people saw that and they're scratching their own heads and going, what's he done here exactly? So I decided not to, be covert about it, and I made a video explaining what had gone on. So yeah, if that's something that interests you, then by all means, check it out.
Well, Thomas, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to join us on the New Wave Music Podcast. We hope that the U.S. tour is a smashing success. The lineup for that one is amazing. And also best of luck with your book and the U.S. tour coming later this summer.
Good to see you guys. Take care.
Well, looking ahead at our next episode, T-Bone, brace yourself. We've got yet another interview. This time, Nick Hayward from Haircut 100 will be joining us here in the New Wave Studios. We hope to be chatting with him about his reformation of his band, the upcoming tour with ABC and Howard Jones, and much more. We hope you join us.
If this is your first time listening, we thank you and ask that you please subscribe. That's a great way to support us. And if you enjoyed this episode, please feel free to leave us a 5-star review. You can also find us on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. Just search for New Wave Music Podcast. We'll catch you on the next episode.